The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener as I first stepped into our new apartment. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight that struggled to penetrate the grime-coated windows. It wasn't much, but it was ours. My roommate, Mark, was already there, unpacking boxes with an unsettlingly enthusiastic grin. He was a lanky guy with greasy dark hair that always seemed to hang in his eyes, and a nervous energy that made me uneasy. Mark had found the listing online, a steal for a two-bedroom place just off campus. He was a few years older than me, a night student with a past he kept shrouded in mystery. I was a little apprehensive about moving in with a complete stranger, but I was desperate. My previous living situation had imploded and I needed a place to stay, fast. Plus, Mark seemed harmless enough. A little odd maybe, but harmless. He talked non-stop as we unpacked, his voice a high-pitched, nervous chatter that grated on my nerves. He told me about his dreams of becoming a writer, about his collection of vintage horror comics, about his fear of the dark. I mostly tuned him out, focusing on unpacking my boxes and trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that was settling in the pit of my stomach. The apartment itself was small and cramped, with dingy walls and stained carpets. The only window in my room looked out onto a brick wall, and the constant hum of traffic from the street below was already starting to give me a headache. As I unpacked the last of my belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. This place felt wrong, and something told me that my new roommate was not who he seemed. The first few weeks were uneventful, if a little unsettling. Mark kept mostly to himself, spending his days locked in his room, only emerging for classes and late-night trips to the all-night diner down the street. He would often return in the early hours of the morning, his eyes bloodshot and his clothes reeking of stale cigarette smoke. I tried to talk to him, to get to know him better, but he would just shrug me off, his gaze darting nervously around the room. There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't anything he said or did exactly. It was more of a feeling, a sense that something was deeply, unsettlingly wrong. I found myself avoiding him, making excuses not to be home. I spent more and more time at the library, studying late into the night, anything to avoid returning to the apartment. One night, I woke to a strange scratching sound coming from the other side of my bedroom wall. It was faint at first, like claws scraping against wood. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear over the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, sending chills down my spine. I told myself it was probably just rats in the walls. The building was old after all, but deep down a primal fear twisted in my gut. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something sinister lurking just out of sight, and for the first time since moving in, I felt a surge of genuine terror. Days turned into weeks, and the feeling of unease only intensified. I started noticing strange things around the apartment, things out of place, missing or rearranged. At first I dismissed it as my own forgetfulness, the stress of school getting to me. But as the incidents piled up, I couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong. One evening, I returned to the apartment to find the front door slightly ajar. My heart leaped into my throat. I distinctly remembered locking it that morning. I cautiously pushed the door open, my hand hovering over the pepper spray I had started carrying in my pocket. The apartment was dark and silent, except for the incessant dripping of a leaky faucet in the bathroom. "Mark?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. I flipped on the light switch, but the bulb flickered and died, plunging the room back into darkness. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Fumbling for my phone, I used the dim light from the screen to navigate through the apartment. The air was heavy and still, thick with an unnatural silence that seemed to press down on me like a physical weight. And that's when I saw it. On the coffee table in the living room, lying open, was a book. It was Mark's, a leather-bound volume with yellowed pages and a strange, musky smell. I had seen it on his bookshelf before, but something about it had always unnerved me. I picked it up cautiously, my fingers tracing the strange symbols embossed on the cover. It was a diary of some sort, filled with Mark's cramped handwriting and disturbing sketches that made my stomach churn. And as I flipped through its pages, a chilling realization washed over me. This wasn't just a diary, it was a chronicle of something dark, something sinister, something that I couldn't begin to comprehend. Mark's diary was unsettling, to say the least. It was filled with rambling, often incoherent entries that hinted at a dark obsession with the occult. There were strange symbols drawn all over the pages, symbols I didn't recognize but that seemed to pulsate with an eerie energy. He drew diagrams that looked like ancient summoning circles, accompanied by cryptic notes scrawled in a language that wasn't English. It was clear that Mark wasn't just a horror fan. He was delving into something dangerous, something beyond the realm of fiction. Each page I turned filled me with a creeping dread, the words and images etching themselves onto my mind like a curse. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was just a harmless hobby, a way for Mark to explore his dark fantasies. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was a raw, desperate hunger in his words, a yearning for something dark and powerful. The diary spoke of ancient entities, of forbidden rituals, of a world hidden beneath the surface of our own, a world that Mark seemed determined to unlock. His drawings were even more disturbing than his writing. Twisted, grotesque figures with vacant eyes and razor-sharp teeth stared back at me from the pages. They were the stuff of nightmares, creatures born from the darkest recesses of the human psyche. The detail in each drawing was meticulous, almost obsessive. It was as if Mark had poured every ounce of his being into these illustrations, as if they were more than just drawings but a window into his troubled soul. The discovery of the diary left me shaken. I tried to focus on my studies, to push the unsettling images and words from my mind, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to consume my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was hiding something sinister that lurked just beneath the surface of his nervous demeanor. I started noticing other strange occurrences around the apartment. There were times when I would wake in the dead of night to the sound of Mark whispering in his room. The whispers were low and guttural, like the chanting of some ancient language. I would press my ear against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make out the words, but they remained frustratingly unintelligible, a haunting murmur that seemed to seep into my dreams, leaving me with a lingering sense of unease. One night, the whispers escalated into frantic muttering, punctuated by the scraping of furniture and the thud of something heavy hitting the floor. I lay in bed paralyzed by fear as the sounds from the other side of the wall grew louder, more desperate. I wanted to get up, to see what was happening, but terror had me in its grip. The commotion went on for what felt like hours before finally subsiding into an eerie silence. I lay awake until dawn, my mind racing, my body trembling with a fear I couldn't explain. The next morning, I tried to confront Mark about the noise, but he just shrugged it off, his eyes evading mine. "Just a bad dream," he mumbled, his gaze darting nervously around the room. But I knew it was more than that. Something was terribly wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living with a ticking time bomb. As the days passed, the strange incidents continued to escalate. Small objects started disappearing from the apartment. At first, it was just little things, a pen here, a magazine there. I told myself I was just being forgetful, misplacing things in the chaos of our shared living space. But as the days turned into weeks, the disappearances became more frequent, more noticeable. I lost my favorite scarf, a silver locket that belonged to my grandmother, even a textbook I needed for an important exam. It was as if things were vanishing into thin air, leaving no trace behind. I searched the apartment high and low, but the missing items were nowhere to be found. The disappearances were always small, insignificant items, but their absence was unsettling nonetheless. It felt like a violation, an invisible hand reaching into my life and taking what it wanted. One afternoon I returned home to find my room in disarray. Drawers were pulled open, their contents strewn across the floor. Clothes were pulled from hangers, books tossed haphazardly from shelves. It was as if someone had been searching for something, rifling through my belongings with reckless abandon. Panic surged through me. I checked my jewelry box, my wallet, my laptop, all still there. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the violation, the sense of someone intruding into my personal space, filled me with a chilling dread. I confronted Mark about the mess, my voice trembling with barely suppressed fear. He denied any knowledge, his eyes wide and innocent. But as he spoke, I noticed a small, dark stain on his sleeve, a stain that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The bloodstain on Mark's shirt was the final straw. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that I was living with someone dangerous. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that there was a perfectly rational explanation for everything that had been happening. But, deep down, I knew something was amiss. Mark's behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped going to class altogether, spending all his time locked in his room, the sounds of his frantic whispering and strange chanting echoing through the apartment. He would emerge only for food, his eyes bloodshot, his clothes disheveled, a manic energy radiating from him. Whenever I tried to talk to him, he would either ignore me completely or mumble incoherent responses, his gaze distant and unfocused. Then one day, Mark vanished. I returned home from a grueling day at the library to find his room empty. His bed was stripped bare, his belongings gone. The only sign that he had ever been there was the faint lingering scent of stale cigarettes and the strange musky odor that always seemed to cling to him. Panic seized me. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, every nook and cranny of the apartment, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. I called his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried texting him, but my messages went unanswered. As the hours ticked by and Mark remained missing, a chilling realization dawned on me. I was living in a nightmare, and I had no idea how to escape. The silence in the apartment was deafening. It pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. Mark's absence was more than just unsettling. It was unnerving, like a missing piece of a puzzle that left the whole picture distorted and wrong. The longer he was gone, the more my anxiety grew. I paced the apartment, checking and rechecking his room, as if he might magically reappear if I just looked hard enough. The diary. I had to find the diary. Maybe it held some clue, some explanation for Mark's sudden disappearance. I tore through his room again, this time with a frantic energy, tossing aside clothes and papers, overturning furniture in my desperate search. But the diary was gone. It was as if it had vanished along with Mark, leaving behind only a void where it had once been. The weight of the missing diary settled in my gut like a leaden stone. It was one thing for Mark to disappear, it was another entirely for his disturbing writings to vanish as well. It felt like confirmation that something was terribly wrong, that my worst fears were being realized. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to calm down, to think logically. Maybe Mark had simply left, taken his things and gone. Maybe he'd gotten tired of the city, of school, of me. But a darker instinct whispered a different story. It spoke of ancient rituals, of forbidden knowledge, of a darkness that consumed those who dared to peer too closely into its depths. And as the hours ticked by, that darkness seemed to seep into the very walls of the apartment, suffocating me with its unseen presence. Night fell, and the shadows in the apartment stretched and deepened, twisting into monstrous shapes that danced at the edge of my vision. I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything but the growing sense of dread that coiled in my stomach. I turned on all the lights, the harsh glare doing little to dispel the oppressive gloom that had settled over the apartment. The silence was unbearable. I turned on the TV, the sound of canned laughter and meaningless chatter grating on my nerves but providing a small measure of comfort against the oppressive quiet. I tried to read, but the words swam before my eyes, meaningless symbols on a page. Mark's absence was a gaping hole in the fabric of my reality, and I felt myself unraveling at the edges, my carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake for hours, listening to the creaking of the old building, every groan and sigh of the pipes sounding like footsteps in the hall, every rustle of wind against the window like whispered threats. My mind raced, replaying every strange incident, every unsettling conversation, every fleeting glimpse of the darkness that lurked beneath Mark's nervous facade. I thought about the diary, about the strange symbols and disturbing drawings, about the whispers I'd heard through the wall late at night. What had Mark gotten himself involved in? And what had become of him now? The questions echoed endlessly in the empty chamber of my mind, offering no answers, only amplifying my fear. The apartment, once a shared space, now felt cold and alien, every corner holding the potential for some unseen horror. I felt a desperate urge to escape, to run from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to me like a shroud. But where could I go? Who would believe me? Morning arrived, a pale sliver of light cutting through the darkness that had held me captive throughout the night. With the first rays of dawn came a renewed sense of urgency. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and wait, hoping that Mark would magically reappear. I started by calling all the local hospitals, my voice trembling as I rattled off Mark's description, my heart sinking with each negative response. No, there was no record of anyone matching his description being admitted. No, they hadn't seen him. No, they couldn't help me. Next, I tried his friends, or at least the few people I knew he occasionally interacted with at school. But my inquiries were met with shrugs and blank stares. Mark was a loner, a ghost who drifted through the periphery of their lives, leaving no lasting impression. No one had seen him, no one knew where he might be, and no one seemed particularly concerned. As the day wore on and my calls went unanswered or yielded no new information, a cold knot of despair tightened in my chest. I was on my own. No one knew Mark was missing, and no one seemed to care. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. I had no one to rely on but myself, no one to turn to for help. I considered going to the police, but the thought filled me with a strange reluctance. How could I explain Mark's disappearance without sounding crazy? What evidence did I have besides a gut feeling that something was terribly wrong? The diary. The diary would have been proof, a tangible piece of evidence that spoke to Mark's state of mind. But the diary was gone, vanished along with its author. The missing person report felt woefully inadequate, a few scant details scribbled on a form that couldn't possibly encompass the strangeness of Mark's disappearance. The officer who took my statement listened with a detached politeness that bordered on boredom. He'd heard it all before: the concerned roommate, the missing student, the vague anxieties that hinted at something darker lurking beneath the surface. He asked all the standard questions. When had I last seen Mark? Had he mentioned any plans to travel? Were there any personal problems that might have caused him to leave? I answered as best I could, trying to downplay the strange incidents, the unsettling behavior, the diary that had vanished without a trace. I knew how my story sounded, like the ramblings of a stressed-out student, not the desperate plea of someone who feared the worst. The officer promised to look into it, but his tone was flat, devoid of any real concern. I knew he didn't believe me, that he saw me as just another face in a long line of worried friends and relatives reporting a missing loved one. He left me with a flimsy pamphlet about missing persons and a hollow assurance that they would contact me if they had any leads. As I closed the door behind the officer, the weight of my solitude settled on me like a physical burden. The police weren't going to help. They didn't understand. No one did. I was alone, trapped in a nightmare that was slowly but surely consuming me. and the worst part was, I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The day Mark disappeared started like any other. A dreary, overcast Tuesday. Rain lashed against the windows of our apartment, mirroring the turmoil brewing inside me. Mark had been acting stranger than usual. He barely slept, spending his nights hunched over his desk, whispering to something I couldn't see. His obsession with the occult had reached a fever pitch. He would spend hours poring over his books, his eyes gleaming with a feverish intensity that sent shivers down my spine. The air in the apartment was thick with the scent of incense and something else, something ancient and vaguely metallic that made my stomach churn. I tried to talk to him, to pull him back from the edge of whatever abyss he was teetering on. But my words were met with a vacant stare and a dismissive wave of his hand. That morning he emerged from his room looking more haggard than ever. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pallid, his clothes rumpled and smelling faintly of sulfur. He mumbled a greeting, his voice hoarse and strained, and practically inhaled his breakfast without once making eye contact. As I watched him, a cold wave of fear washed over me. Something was terribly wrong. Mark was gone, replaced by something else, something that wore his skin but held none of his warmth or humanity. I wanted to reach out, to shake him, to scream at him, to snap out of it. But something held me back, a primal instinct warning me to keep my distance. He left shortly after, disappearing into the rain-soaked streets without a word. I watched him go from the window, his retreating figure swallowed by the swirling mist, and a sense of foreboding settled over me like a shroud. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I wouldn't see him again. The hours that followed were agonizing. I tried to focus on my studies, to lose myself in the familiar comfort of textbooks and lecture notes, but Mark's absence hung over me like a pall. The silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by the incessant drumming of rain against the windows. My phone rang, the shrill tone cutting through the oppressive quiet like a knife. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. It was Mark. Relief flooded through me, followed quickly by a surge of apprehension. "Hello?" I answered, my voice trembling slightly. Silence. For a moment all I could hear was the static hiss of the phone line and the frantic beating of my own heart. Then a faint sound like someone struggling to breathe, followed by a muffled groan. "Mark? Is that you? What's wrong?" The sounds on the other end of the line grew louder, more frantic. A gurgling gasp, a sharp intake of breath, a thud that sent a jolt of fear through me. Then a voice, but it wasn't Mark's. It was a low, guttural growl, laced with something ancient and evil that seemed to slither through the phone line and wrap itself around my spine. I don't know how long I listened to that sound, that unholy symphony of suffering and malice. Time seemed to stretch and distort, the walls of the apartment closing in on me as a primal terror took root in my gut. Then, as abruptly as it began, the sound stopped. The line went dead, leaving me in stunned silence. Section 3. The search begins. I stared at the phone in my hand, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. It couldn't have been Mark, it couldn't be. And yet deep down I knew it was true. Something had happened to him. Something terrible. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding the fear that threatened to paralyze me. I had to find him. I had to know what happened. I grabbed my jacket and keys, racing out the door and into the rain-soaked streets. The city was a labyrinth of glistening streets and shadowy alleys, the air thick with the smell of wet asphalt and exhaust fumes. I ran blindly, following a trail only I could see, my mind replaying the muffled sounds from the phone call, each gasp and groan fueling my desperate search. I went to all the places Mark frequented, the library, the coffee shop where he liked to write, the park where we sometimes went for walks. But no one had seen him. He had vanished, swallowed whole by the sprawling metropolis. As the hours ticked by and my search yielded nothing but dead ends, a crushing sense of despair washed over me. I was running out of time. I could feel it in my gut, a cold certainty that whispered of a darkness closing in, of a fate too terrible to contemplate. Section 4. An Eerie Silence. Exhausted and emotionally drained, I returned to the apartment, the weight of Mark's absence pressing down on me with renewed force. The silence that greeted me was deafening, amplified by the knowledge that he was out there somewhere, lost in a darkness I couldn't fathom. His room was untouched, his belongings exactly where he had left them. The air was stale, heavy with the lingering scent of incense and that other unidentifiable odor that spoke of ancient rituals and forbidden knowledge. I stood there for a long moment, my gaze sweeping over the familiar objects, each one a painful reminder of the friend I had lost. The diary. I had to find the diary. Maybe it held some clue, some explanation for Mark's disappearance, for the chilling sounds I had heard on the phone. I tore through his belongings, my movements frantic, desperate. But the diary was gone. It was as if it had vanished along with Mark, leaving behind only a void where it had once been. As I stood there in the center of his empty room, the full weight of my situation crashed down on me. Mark was gone. The diary was gone. And I was utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare that was only just beginning. The silence that surrounded me was no longer empty. Section 1. The apartment's transformation. The days following Mark's disappearance were a blur of fear and paranoia. The silence of the apartment, once a source of comfort, now pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. It felt like the walls themselves were watching me, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. The once familiar space felt alien, hostile. The air grew thick and heavy, laced with the cloying scent of incense and a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The temperature fluctuated wildly, from stiflingly hot to bone-chillingly cold, sending shivers down my spine. Sleep offered no escape. My dreams were haunted by Mark's face, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light, his voice a guttural growl echoing in the darkness. Even in the daylight, shadows seemed to twist and writhe in the corners of my vision. The once mundane objects in the apartment took on a sinister aspect. A coat rack resembled a skeletal hand reaching out from the darkness. The pattern on the rug morphed into a swirling vortex, threatening to suck me into its depths. I felt like I was losing my mind, teetering on the precipice of a madness I couldn't escape. The apartment itself seemed to be warping, changing in subtle but unsettling ways. Cracks snaked their way across the walls, forming patterns that resembled the strange symbols from Mark's diary. The paint peeled and blistered, revealing patches of bare plaster that felt cold and clammy to the touch. And always, there was that smell, a mixture of decay, incense, and something else. Something ancient and evil that chilled me to the core. The whispers started subtly. At first, I dismissed them as the creaking of the old building, the wind whistling through drafty window panes, the normal sounds of a city settling into night. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, a low guttural murmur that sent shivers down my spine. I would lie awake at night, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to make out the words. They were faint, indistinct, but undeniably there. Sometimes I thought I could make out Mark's voice, distorted and warped, calling my name from some distant, unreachable place. Other times the whispers were deeper, more guttural, laced with an alien cadence that filled me with a primal dread. The whispers followed me everywhere I went within the confines of the apartment. They seemed to intensify when I was alone, as if whatever entity was trapped within these walls was testing me, probing for weakness. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was all in my head, a manifestation of my grief and guilt. But deep down, I knew the truth. The apartment was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison, and I was trapped inside with something evil. Desperate for silence, I tried everything I could think of to drown out the whispers. I blasted music, the sounds of my favorite bands clashing against the low murmur from the walls. I turned on the television, the inane chatter of talk shows and the canned laughter of sitcoms providing a temporary distraction. I even resorted to sleeping with earplugs, but the whispers seemed to seep through the barriers I erected, worming their way into my subconscious, haunting my dreams. One morning I woke to find the apartment covered in a fine layer of dust. It clung to every surface, coating the furniture, the floor, even the air itself with a gritty film. At first I attributed it to the old building, the inevitable accumulation of time and neglect. But as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. The dust wasn't randomly scattered. It formed patterns, intricate designs that snaked across the floor, climbed the walls and spread across the ceiling like some macabre tapestry. The patterns were familiar, chillingly so. They were the same symbols I had seen in Mark's diary, the same symbols he had been so obsessed with in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Terror gripped me, constricting my throat, making it difficult to breathe. It was as if the apartment itself was communicating, using the language of Mark's obsession to convey a message I couldn't ignore. A wave of nausea washed over me as I realized the truth. The apartment wasn't just haunted by Mark's memory. It was infected, corrupted by whatever dark force he had unwittingly unleashed. I tried to clean the symbols away, desperately scrubbing at the dust with a damp cloth, but it was no use. The patterns remained, etched into the very fabric of the apartment, a constant reminder of the evil that lurked beneath the surface. I was surrounded, trapped in a nightmare of Mark's making, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The symbols were a warning, a prophecy of things to come. And as I stared at the twisted, arcane designs, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the worst was yet to come. Days turned into weeks, and the oppressive atmosphere in the apartment grew heavier, more suffocating. The whispers became a constant presence, a chorus of voices murmuring just beyond the veil of reality. The symbols, once confined to the dust, began to appear everywhere, scratched into the furniture, etched into the walls, even appearing as fleeting images in the flickering light of the television. I felt myself slipping, my grasp on reality growing more tenuous with each passing day. Sleep offered no respite, my dreams filled with disturbing visions of Mark, his face contorted in a silent scream, his hands reaching out from a swirling vortex of darkness. Despair threatened to consume me, but something kept me going, a flicker of hope, a refusal to give in to the encroaching darkness. Then, one day, I found something. It was a small, leather-bound notebook tucked away on the top shelf of Mark's closet, hidden behind a stack of old textbooks. My heart pounded in my chest as I recognized it. Mark's other diary, the one he kept separate from the one filled with arcane symbols and disturbing rituals. This diary was different. Instead of rambling pronouncements and cryptic sketches, it contained Mark's thoughts, his fears, his hopes. As I flipped through the brittle pages, a glimmer of understanding began to dawn. Mark hadn't been a willing participant in whatever dark force had consumed him. He had been a victim, lured in by promises of power and knowledge, only to find himself in over his head. The entries were filled with regret, with a desperate longing to undo what he had done, and in the final pages, scribbled in a shaky hand, I found a clue, a single sentence that offered a glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness. The key lies where the light cannot reach. The key lies where the light cannot reach. The words echoed in my mind, a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness that had descended upon the apartment. Mark's final message, a cryptic clue to unraveling the mystery of his disappearance and breaking free from the nightmare that had become my reality. But where was the light cannot reach? I paced the apartment, my gaze sweeping over the familiar surroundings, now distorted and menacing through the lens of fear and paranoia. The whispers seemed to intensify, mocking my efforts, their guttural murmurs weaving a tapestry of dread around me. My eyes fell on the single window in the living room, the weak sunlight struggling to penetrate the grime-coated glass. It was then I realized, the one place in the entire apartment where light truly struggled to reach was the basement. A dank, cavernous space beneath the building, accessible only through a warped wooden door tucked away in the back of the kitchen, the basement. A shiver ran down my spine as I recalled the few times I had ventured down there. The air was always heavy, thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something ancient and vaguely unsettling. The darkness was absolute, swallowing even the feeble beams of my flashlight, and the silence was unnerving, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of unseen water. It was the perfect place to hide something, or for something to hide. Mark's final message had pointed me in this direction, but was I walking into a trap? Was this some twisted game orchestrated by the same dark force that had consumed him? Doubt gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside. I had to know, had to see this through to the end, even if it meant confronting the darkness that awaited me in the basement's depths. The air grew noticeably colder as I descended the creaking wooden stairs, each step sending shivers up my spine. The single bare bulb that hung precariously from the ceiling did little to penetrate the oppressive gloom, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted and writhed along the damp concrete walls. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, dust, and something else, something ancient and vaguely metallic that caught in my throat and made me cough. My heart pounded in my chest, each thud echoing in the oppressive silence. The whispers, ever present in the apartment above, seemed to fade away down here, replaced by a different kind of silence. One that felt heavy, expectant, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The basement was a labyrinth of forgotten objects and discarded memories. Rusty tools hung haphazardly on the walls, cobweb-draped furniture loomed in the shadows, and stacks of mildewing boxes lined the far wall, their contents a mystery lost to time. I moved cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating fragments of forgotten lives, each one a potential hiding place, a potential source of dread. As I ventured deeper into the basement's depths, I noticed something strange about the floor. Scratched into the concrete, almost invisible beneath the layers of dust and grime, were the same symbols I had seen in Mark's diary, the same symbols that had haunted my waking hours and invaded my dreams. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there, like breadcrumbs leading me deeper into the heart of the mystery. The symbols led me to a far corner of the basement where a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and weathered, stood ajar. A faint light emanated from the opening, casting flickering shadows that danced like phantoms across the opposite wall. I paused, my hand hovering over the door, my senses on high alert. The air felt different here, charged with an energy that sent a shiver down my spine. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room beyond was small, cramped, and sparsely furnished, with bare concrete walls and a dirt floor. In the center of the room, a single flickering candle illuminated a makeshift altar draped in a faded black cloth. Arranged on the altar were a collection of objects that sent a jolt of fear through me. A worn leather-bound book, its pages filled with arcane symbols and disturbing illustrations, a silver athame with an intricately carved handle, and a small clay bowl filled with a dark, viscous liquid that reeked of iron and decay. My blood ran cold as I recognized the book. It was Mark's missing diary, the one he had kept hidden from me, the one that held the key to his descent into darkness. As I stepped closer, drawn by a morbid curiosity I couldn't resist, I noticed something else. Etched into the dirt floor, surrounding the altar like a protective barrier, were the same symbols that had led me here, their lines glowing faintly in the candlelight. It was then I understood. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a ritual chamber, a place where Mark had been practicing his dark craft, where he had unwittingly opened a door to something ancient and evil. A wave of dizziness washed over me, the air growing thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The flickering candlelight seemed to dim, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed along the walls, their movements taking on a life of their own. The whispers, absent in the rest of the basement, returned with a vengeance, swirling around me, their guttural murmurs laced with a mocking laughter that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back, my hand instinctively reaching out to steady myself, my gaze fixed on the altar and its unsettling contents. As I watched, the dark liquid in the clay bowl began to bubble and churn, as if alive, its surface rippling and distorting the reflected candlelight. The air grew heavy with the metallic tang of blood and something else, something ancient and unholy that turned my stomach. And then I saw him, a figure taking shape within the swirling darkness above the altar, its form shifting and coalescing, gradually resolving into a grotesque parody of Mark. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, his skin stretched taut over his skeletal frame, and a cruel smile twisted his lips, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Terror rooted me to the spot, my voice caught in my throat, my body paralyzed by a fear so profound it transcended rational thought. The figure stretched out a hand, its long, bony fingers tipped with what looked like claws, and beckoned me closer. "Join me," it rasped, its voice a hollow echo of Mark's, laced with an alien cadence that chilled me to the core. "Become one with the darkness." And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The candle sputtered and died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The whispers faded, the air grew still, and the only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. I stumbled back, my hand frantically searching for the light switch, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. The basement, once a place of hidden secrets and forgotten memories, now felt like a tomb, a testament to the darkness that lay hidden beneath the surface of the ordinary. I had found the key, but in doing so, I had unlocked a truth more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. Mark was gone, consumed by a force he couldn't control, and I was next. Panic seized me. I scrambled back, my foot catching on a loose floorboard, sending me sprawling onto the damp concrete. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. Every creak of the old house, every rustle in the walls sounded like approaching footsteps, like the whispering voices closing in. I had to get out. I scrambled to my feet, my hands outstretched, feeling my way blindly through the suffocating darkness. I crashed into unseen objects, the impact sending jolts of pain through my body. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I couldn't give in. Not here. Not now. Mark's fate flashed before my eyes, a chilling reminder of what awaited me if I didn't escape this place. Finally, my outstretched hand found the door frame. I stumbled through the opening, slamming the heavy wooden door behind me, the sound echoing through the empty basement like a death knell. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers closing around the cold plastic. The bare bulb flickered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow that did little to penetrate the lingering darkness. I didn't waste another second. I raced up the creaking wooden stairs, each step a desperate prayer for escape. The air grew lighter, the oppressive atmosphere of the basement lifting as I neared the top. I burst through the kitchen door, slamming it shut behind me, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the apartment. I stood there for a moment, my chest heaving, my clothes damp with sweat and the lingering chill of the basement. The familiar surroundings of the apartment, once a source of comfort, now felt alien, tainted by the darkness I had witnessed below. I knew then that I could never stay here, not after what I had seen, not after what I knew. I packed a bag with essentials, my hands shaking as I gathered my belongings. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face, his eyes burning with an unholy light, his voice a guttural growl echoing in the darkness. The whispers followed me, even outside the apartment walls, a constant reminder of the evil I had unleashed. I moved from city to city, job to job, desperately trying to outrun the memories, but there was no escaping the past. It clung to me like a shadow, its presence a constant weight on my soul. The fear became a constant companion, coloring my every thought, my every interaction. The dreams continued, vivid, terrifying nightmares in which I was back in that basement, trapped in the darkness with Mark, his laughter echoing through the endless corridors of my subconscious. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the whispers still ringing in my ears. I sought solace in therapy, in medication, in anything that might dull the sharp edges of my trauma. But the darkness lingered, a persistent undercurrent in the fabric of my reality. My story was met with skepticism, with pity, sometimes even with fear. No one believed me. No one understood the depths of the horror I had witnessed. I was labeled as unstable, delusional, a danger to myself and others. Doors were closed in my face. Relationships crumbled under the weight of my secret. I was alone, adrift in a world that no longer made sense, haunted by a past I couldn't escape. Years have passed since that fateful night. The details have faded, the edges blurred by time and trauma. But the fear remains, a dull ache in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the fragility of reality. I still jump at shadows, flinch at unexpected noises. The smell of incense, once a source of comfort, now sends a shiver down my spine. I avoid basements, those dark subterranean spaces that hold the potential for hidden truths and unspeakable horrors. I have tried to move on, to rebuild my life from the ashes of that nightmare. But a part of me knows that I will never truly be free. The darkness that consumed Mark, that almost consumed me, is still out there, lurking just beyond the veil of perception, waiting for its chance to break through. The question that haunts me, the question that keeps me awake at night, is simple. Was I spared that night, or am I living on borrowed time? Is there a part of Mark, a fragment of his soul, trapped somewhere within me, waiting to resurface? The truth, like the darkness itself, remains elusive. And as I sit here, in the cold light of dawn, the whispers begin again, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. Their voices a chilling reminder that some doors are best left unopened, some secrets best left buried. The story is far from over. It never truly ends. Not for me, not for anyone who has stared into the abyss and felt its gaze linger long after they have looked away.